So welcome everyone. It is an honor and privilege to be able to moderate this distinguished panel today. We are talking today about artificial intelligence and the weaponization of genetic data. This webinar is sponsored by both FutureGrasp and GeneInfoSec, hosted by FutureGrasp and GeneInfoSec. And we will be joined by 4 panelists. First, though, I'd like to give a quick introduction and do some housekeeping. First, our vision about this webinar. So why are we holding this webinar? So in general, it is the goal of GeneInfoSec and FutureGrasp for running this webinar to engage leaders in the governments, intergovernmental organizations, and business to better appreciate the risks and opportunities in this area of AI and genetic data. So I would like to give a little bit of house cleaning, or housekeeping rather, first. So the panelist slides are there. You can look up their information at your leisure, but basically I'm going to give very brief introductions in the beginning. A few housekeeping points. Please do follow proper WebEx etiquette. Of course, there is a chat button on the bottom of your display. So if you'd like to, please keep chat limited to insights on panel discussions only. And note that the comments will be shared with everyone unless you engage the private chat feature to a specific individual. We welcome questions during the panel, of course, so there is a Q&A button also on the bottom of your display. Please post questions to the panelists during the sessions. And if we have time toward the end of each panel, we will ask a select few. The webinar flow of the panel will be roughly 5 minutes per panelist for opening comments, followed by a moderator questions from myself, and then attendee questions if the time remains. So I'd like to transition right now to my good friend and colleague, Sterling Sawaya out of GeneInfoSec, who will give an overview of the space of genetic information and AI in general.
Thank you, Tom.
Sterling, go ahead.
Honored to be here. Really excited to share this this great panel with everybody. The topic today is genetic information and how advances in AI can be used to weaponize it. And many of these advances are unstoppable. For example, our ancestry is of great interest to us, and we, of course, want to be able to find long-lost relatives, but the same advances there will allow a loss of anonymity, which means that these genetic databases can be re-identified. Just in the same fashion, medical advancements for predicting diseases will be very useful for your doctor to be able to prevent you from having diseases manifest. However, that same information that AI can predict can also be used to make you sick. And then as we look towards advances in biotechnology, there's some really great advances that are coming out that will lead to cures, but in the same way, that technology can be used to develop targeted bioweapons. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Sterling. So there's one other point I wanted to make in terms of the panelists and so forth. This is the panelist information. Please note that the full webinar is being recorded and will be distributed later to speakers in the social media and on GeneInfoSec and FutureGrasp websites. Beyond the names and affiliations of the moderators and speakers, no personal information will be divulged, however. So I'd like to transition now to the panel itself. We'd like to start with my distinguished colleague, Mr. Irakli Beridze of the UNICRI, the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute out of The Hague, the Netherlands. And Irakli, if you could make some opening comments regarding this vast space of genetic data and AI especially. So I'll leave it to you, take it from there. And if you'd like to give a little bit more introduction about yourself, feel free and do that, but I don't want to consume time giving such introductions from my perspective. Take it away, Irakli. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks a lot. First of all, I would like to really thank you for inviting me. Tom and I, we go a long way. We cooperate on many issues, on number of undertakings, events, and research which we conducted together on the AI space, and the government's initiatives on the AI, which we conducted the research on this as well, and many other initiatives together. My name is Irakli Beridze. I'm heading a Center for AI and Robotics for United Nations agency UNICRI, and we are focused dealing on the issues related to how artificial intelligence can be on the one hand, used by criminals for malicious purposes or terrorists, or at the same time, how AI could be used by law enforcement agencies to solve crime-related problems. At the same time, we pay due attention to the issues related to how artificial intelligence both could be used to solve the problems which are crime-related, but within the human rights and fundamental freedoms accepted framework, so that to do it in a right and responsible way. Within that, we are conducting numerous researches. We are actually just now in a couple of weeks, we'll be releasing a major research on malicious use of AI by criminal actors and terrorists, together with Europol and Trend Micro, and this will be available on our website. And next November, we're together with Interpol conducting a major global event, AI for law enforcement. And through Tom, if you are interested to follow these discussions, will be a week-long discussion. I'll be happy to share the registration link. In general, sort of just some general comments. AI is advancing, as you all know, rapidly, and this is applied in every sphere of our lives. At the same time, genetic information is being collected and is being stored mostly in country data banks, and could be accessed or extracted and could be accessed by various actors easily. So I'll be discussing more in Q&A section, I suppose, but in general, both and convergence of these two issues are extremely important. At the United Nations level, we pay a very serious attention to it, and we are encouraging governments internationally and nationally to also adopt appropriate legislations to govern such issues. Back to you, Tom.
Well, thank you, Irakli. So just marching down in relatively alphabetical order, Aaron, maybe you can make the next opening comments.
Will do, Tom. Thank you. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'm going to tap out on any bio-related commentary. You see my affiliations on the slides here and jump right into the content. I'll try and nutshell my response to this issue from kind of the thought product that we produced into about 5 minutes or so. The Cliff Notes version goes like this. We've got this emergence of genetic data risk, and it's a function, I think, of kind of two primary dimensions. One is convergence, and two is divergence, right? Convergence is really the convergence of technology within the context of our current society and livelihoods. And then secondly, divergence is really a function of this gap between our technology capabilities and our legal, social, ethical expectations. And, we often hear about this gap between technology and the law, and that's pretty much what I'm referring to. So this risk landscape and the drivers of risk are really a function of convergence and divergence. Convergence is really this notion of the benefits of technology in the current context are pushing the integration of genomics into the mainstream, right? We all know that innovation leads. We've got advances in genomics, we've got advances in synthetic bio, add to the mix AI and ML. They're all converging to produce these beneficial innovations in medical science, in clinical practice, right? So things like generating genetic-based preventative diagnostics and therapeutics, being able to predict diseases, disease predispositions, susceptibilities, genetic-specific treatments, and in general to live healthier lives. So, what's currently the promise of moving from this reactive to the preventative treatment through disease prediction, I think, is going to become essential to the practice of medicine moving forward. And as well, I think the predictive power increases, the predictive power of AI ML only increases when we add all this other information, environmental and behavioral kind of cofactors to the predictive models. The net here, I think, is more as we gain more agency in our health and our quality of life, this is driving the proliferation of the technology. Secondly, I think part of this risk landscape driver is this availability, this vast availability of genetic data. I already mentioned these advances in synthetic biology there's been rapid drops in the cost of DNA sequencing, whole genome sequencing, which is essentially your entire blueprint that describes your kind of hereditary roadmap. It's dropped down, it's plummeted. I think, I want to say 20 years ago, it was $1 billion. A few years ago, it was $1,000. And now we're down to $100 per genome, right? So that's a huge factor. We've also got a proliferation of data with regards to private sector collection. We all are familiar with these direct-to-consumer genetic and genealogy services. Pharma companies are collecting consumer and health data in larger and larger quantities. We've also got increasing amounts of government-funded research that renders a lot of this data publicly available. And then further to, it's not that folks are not aware of potential risk, but the current state of the art with regards to anonymization of this data are pretty shallow. It's basically simple kind of transposition of names with numeric identifiers that basically can be trivially re-identified. And then finally, I think the security around the collection and storage of genetic data is generally weak. There's numerous attack vectors, things like exploiting, API-enabled features that allow for third-party sharing. And frankly, from my standpoint with regards to cybersecurity, it's kind of basic blocking and tackling that we're lacking with regards to this data. The second part of this, apart from convergence, is this divergence concept, which is this gap between our technology capabilities and our legal expectations. The current legal and market forces are really not wholly sufficient to incentivize data protection. We've got gaps in legal liability and regulations. And then we've also, from a market perspective, time to market and competitive advantage really predominates over bearing the cost to secure this data. Just briefly on that note, existing hard and soft law does exist, but there are gaps, right? So direct-to-consumer companies are outside the purview of HIPAA. Our primary kind of genetic regulation, which is GINA, doesn't limit access to that data. It only prohibits employers and health insurers from using the information to discriminate in certain circumstances. On the research side of the house, researchers are bound by this notion of the common rule, which applies if they're getting federal funding, and it basically requires them to obtain subjects' consent. But there are substantive and procedural deficiencies there. There's other provisions by NIH related to certificates of confidentiality, but there are gaps there as well. Newer laws such as GDPR and CCPA are relevant but insufficient. Right, so there's inconsistencies and a lack of uniformity regarding triggers for protection, such as the scope of what's unauthorized for the collection, use, and disclosure. There's inconsistencies with regards to the conditions for consent and when enforcement gets triggered. The definition of biometrics doesn't always include genetic data or DNA. So sometimes, biometrics really is just limited to physiological and behavioral data. And while GDPR and CCPA do cover genetic data with regards to biological data collection and commercial sale, the former doesn't apply to non-EU individuals, and the latter is not germane to this large corpus of research data that really comprises the bulk of our publicly available genetic data bases, I should say. And also, I think state laws only cover companies who do business in the state or engage with residents of that state. Finally, I guess I would say that another large gap would be for those rights afforded, they don't extend protection for the genetic privacy of relatives of individuals who choose to, who consent to disclose their own data. And we know that people can be identified from relatives. Throw in some complicating factors that, the cost and the manifestation of harms from the misuse of genetic data can be latent, right? So unless it's in your face, people tend to sort of check out and not think that it's a concern. We know that DNA is a high value asset target. It's immutable, it's unique, it's information risk, juxtaposed to things like credit cards or exogenous identifiers. And we know that there's huge knowledge and control asymmetries between the government, industry, and individuals regarding, collection, use, and disclosure of genetic information. The net result is this increased threat and vulnerability surface. We know that AI and ML can amplify threats and expand the attack surface because they can improve our ability to identify targets with genetic information, match linking data that's not genetic in all sorts of databases with genetic information that has metadata that cross links. And then I think just the risks is you've got identification and profiling risks, right? Direct identifiability, because genetic data is both inherently PII and it's PHI. You've got risk of secondary identification via relatives, as well as this kind of trivial ability to re-identify by match linking with publicly available data sets. Another risk is the exposure of medical information. And then finally, I think a lot of this gets wrapped up into this worst case scenario of the broader social welfare risk associated with biowarfare, which is essentially this risk of weaponizing these contagious pathogens. And that really, people sort of can criticize this argument as being way out there. But if you really look at the adversary playbook in any sort of risk situation, this kind of checks off all the boxes, which is to say the motive, means, and opportunity are all at play, right? We've got the means and opportunity vis-a-vis the convergence of advancements in synthetic bio, access to genetic info, and then genetic modification advances, like we've all heard of CRISPR-Cas9 advances, and the motive is there. This notion of malicious intention or motivation. Look, there's not a supply shock at play there, so that's always going to be present, especially given that can ensue. So I'll stop my comments there for now and pass it back to you, Tom.
Great. Thank you very much, Aaron. Brilliant. And so we have some technical difficulties with Alex Salkabar. He's in California right now, and they're experiencing waving blackouts right now. He's been texting me, so I apologize if I look a little distracted during the webinar, but he was going to try and join on audio only, but it doesn't look like he has joined quite yet. So let's go to Sterling's comments next. And if we do get Alex on the horn, we'll loop him in. Otherwise, unfortunately, he won't be able to join. So go ahead, Sterling.
Thanks, Tom. Aaron, great job covering all of those details. I would add that the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, GINA, doesn't apply to companies with fewer than 15 employees. And so there are a number of different loopholes that could be presented. And then just determining when discrimination has occurred based on genetic information and proving that is a potential challenge. I would say that the regulations are relatively weak right now, but moreover, the status quo for how we handle genetic data doesn't address these potential future threats. And this is something that I saw firsthand during my graduate career, where working internationally, we often shared genetic data between different countries. And 10 years ago, we didn't quite accept that genetic data was identifiable. So starting GeneInfoSec to build technology to protect genetic information, the first thing that we ran into was an education problem, where the status quo is to take the name off the database and call it good, and then share it everywhere and have your standard IT protections, which in academia are rather weak. So the other thing that I saw during my academic career was the advancements in machine learning, when applied to genetic data, produce predictors that are somewhat frighteningly strong for potential future diseases. And that's a very big privacy concern. But when we start looking into things like susceptibility towards certain toxins like metals, right now today we can apply machine learning to the genome. And because metals are small and we can predict a protein with some accuracy, we can predict how metals will interact with those proteins. But as we advance in machine learning, we'll do better and better at predicting how not just small molecules, but larger molecules interact with proteins, and then ultimately how proteins interact with proteins. And once we reach these advances, which will be open source for the most part, and if not, will be something that can, there's really no going back. We will have these capabilities in the public domain for predicting susceptibilities to small molecules and ultimately to designing organisms that, frankly, will be doing amazing things. We don't want to stop the technology that will allow us to, for example, design yeast to produce whatever small molecules that we need for drug production or for the new sources of energy, for example. But at the same time, as the lab technology advances, we're looking at capabilities where one individual can set up an automated lab. So they don't need a team of experts to have the ability to create a new organism. And when you combine that with the ability for, let's just say, the weak protections around the information itself, it's very difficult to envision ways to protect against these types of threats. And so, when we think of weapons, it comes to mind, superpowers who can develop these really advanced technologies. But the big problem that I see is that as we advance the technology, smaller groups, rogue nation states, for example, and eventually just a couple individuals will have capabilities at hand. And so, we have this education problem where we need to identify people, to inform people that the data is identifiable. And then, the biotech field and the genetics field is so interdisciplinary that I think the knowledge about how machine learning is advancing really isn't something that most geneticists or most people in biotech are aware of. So this talk is going to be great to help inform people of what we can expect in the future. And as Aaron mentioned, the genetic data is immutable, so it's yours for life. And if we look at threats that might be 20 years from now, we have to be aware that if our genetic information gets out there, those threats are things that we might have to face. And even if an individual's data is breached, that individual might not have any personal concerns about being attacked, but simply because of their ethnicity or their nationality, they may nevertheless become a target. And so when we then think 50 years out, it's very difficult for us to even dream about what technologies will be present. But when we consider that unborn children are having their genomes analyzed and young kids are having their genomes analyzed, those children will have to face these threats in the future. And so we need to do what we can today to protect them. And with that, I'll pass it back to Tom.
Excellent, Sterling. So Alex has joined us as an attendee, so I'm just going to unmute him. And you won't see him on video, but he will be in the audio. So hopefully that'll work. Alex, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, excellent. I'm so excited you could join us, Alex. And so if you want to feel free and give a couple words about what you do and who you are, and then go ahead and make your opening comments, that would be wonderful.
Thank you. And again, I'm so sorry I'm running late. We've had 48 hours of rolling power blackouts, and it's welcome to the new California, everybody. So I am an author and also someone who advises companies on new technologies, specifically focusing on a lot of the areas that Tom looks at, things over the horizon. Genetics is one of those areas. I was the author of a book called The Driver and the Driverless Car, where we talked quite a bit about the future of genetics and genomics and what it might mean. And I was particularly interested to be invited to this conversation because I see this in so many interesting ways as being almost like a replay of what happened with our digital data. And that a lot of this relates to potentially us putting in place as a society, as government, better ways to mitigate or to help people understand what's going on with their genomic data, and ideally give us some sense of agency, because I think that if more of us know about the risks that we're all talking about here, then more of us will be able to defend ourselves against the risks. I'm a little skeptical that the advances in genomics are going to happen quite as fast as some of the other participants are talking about, because more and more what I see, at least to my own visions in genetics, it's actually getting more complicated, not less, and that the interactions are becoming harder to understand. The epigenetics, all of the ways that signal pathways are turned on and off are becoming even more difficult to address in sort of a straightforward fashion. That being said, though, I think that we certainly will witness attempts of genetic attacks in the very near future, and that thinking about how we should defend against them, and at the very baseline, how we should put in place better regulations, controls, and systems to allow us to control our own digital and our own genetic data, just as we're not able to do with digital data, I think will be really critical to the future. Does that cover it, Tom, at all? Or?
That's fantastic, Alex, and I think that segues really nicely into some moderator Q&A. So I'll ask each panelist one or two questions, and they could specifically answer it, but the other panelists feel free to weigh in afterward as well, and then we'll go to hopefully some chat Q&A. So there is a chat button in the bottom right hand of your screen. Anybody who'd like to weigh in with a question during the moderator Q&A. So the first question's to Irakli. So Irakli is an expert in the area of bioweapons and so forth. Specifically, which advances in AI do you see as facilitating development of next generation or advanced bioweapons? And could you clarify which different countries are doing or going to impose protections against these threats?
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. Actually, at our center, we are working on how AI could be used by criminals. There is a lot of thinking within the United Nations on the bioweapons as well. We have a biological weapons convention, and I'll be talking about that as well. Now, from the UN perspective, the Secretary General of the United Nations recently highlighted a lot about the rising threat of bioterrorism in his speech. There's also a lot of discussions related to the threats posed or possible threats posed by the artificial intelligence developments in AI or related technologies. So in general, from our point of view, developments in genetic sequencing technologies during the last decade really allowed researchers from various fields to process more genetic data and extract more genetic information in general, as it's been already mentioned by other panelists. And it also fosters scientific progress and cooperation, which is really a great thing. But at the same time, it raised serious questions and concerns from our perspective. So today, majority, of course, of the collected genetic materials are stored in genetic databases or biobanks, right? So after the storage, they're being circulated among the relevant researchers all throughout the world and making such materials and data easily accessible by relevant parties. On the one hand, it is great. On the other hand, it creates serious issues as well. So despite the advantages of these open scientific models, accessibility of the genetic materials and the crucial genetic information extracted from these materials could lead to some undesired consequences. And such threats also are amplified with developments of the AI and related technology. So as a minimum, malicious actors who access to genetic or who can access to genetic data could use this data to train machine learning models to produce dangerous pathogens, for example, or specifically for targeting individuals based on their ethnicity or ethnical identity. To be more specific, let's say machine learning allows these malicious actors amplify threats by improving their ability to identify targets within genetic databases and then weaponizing such data for exploitation. So indeed, with the help of the new and emerging technologies such as AI or biotechnology such as CRISPR, which becomes widely accessible day by day, malicious actors may have the opportunity to exploit these vulnerabilities by developing deadly and new strains of the pathogens targeting explicitly for certain genetic groups, and that's very dangerous. In the article which you shared, you provided very well and argued examples of introducing toxic metals into a population in order to induce a range of diseases such as Alzheimer's, for example, or certain neurological disorders. So taking all of this into account, of course, we can easily foresee that advancements in AI and related tech, especially the sophistication of the machine learning systems on genetic databases, will definitely increase the possibilities of weaponization of genetic information. And we definitely need to do something about it, and we need to have more of these conversations within the United Nations at the international level and within the nationally within the countries as well. And therefore, it is very important that we facilitate such discussions. So within UN, certainly we or other UN agencies would be happy to take on some of the facilitations of such discussions in the future to mitigate the risks and maximize the benefits of the technology. Back to you, Tom.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Irakli. And that, coming from a very authoritative source such as yourself, that means a lot to all of us and the attendees, I'm certain. Next question, perhaps to Sterling directly. So other than protect genetic information, what steps do you feel can be taken to mitigate against the threats that we've discussed so far? To Sterling.
Thank you, Tom. So I see three different lines of technology here. We have the genetic information, and then we have the developments of sort of lab on a chip or 3D printed labs. And it's very difficult to regulate the laboratory control. So I wouldn't see a very easy line to prevent bad actors from gaining access to biotechnology, but that is one direction. The other direction is to limit AI, to monitor who has access to AI and who might have the capabilities of using it. But ultimately, as we advance in AI, we will need to at least release the description of how it was developed, if not release the code itself. And while we can resist, we can attempt to resist bad actors from gaining access to advances in AI, it's a big challenge to see that as being the direction that we can protect ourselves in. When it comes specifically to designer bioweapons, the DNA, you're able to print out your own DNA to be able to design an organism. And that is probably the strongest protection that we have against developing targeted bioweapons. And today you have to order it from a company, and I know that most companies are doing a good job, the best that they can, to prevent bad DNA sequences from being shared, or at least being shared to the wrong people. However, advances in DNA printing technology are now permitting DNA printing to occur on the benchtop, so that somebody in the lab can say, okay, I want this specific sequence, and a day later it prints that out and they can put that in their organism. I do see that as a challenge. However, monitoring who has access to that DNA printer and perhaps even controlling the capabilities of that printer would be another area which could provide some protection. But ultimately, these are all big challenges that we can't guarantee that 20 years from now, those technologies won't be openly available. So genetic data, however, is something that we can do today. We can protect our genetic information today, and we can work towards technologies and treaties and things that will allow us to protect our genetic information to attempt to prevent some of these threats in the future. Thanks, Tom.
Excellent. Brilliant, Sterling. Thanks so much. And anybody else would like to comment on that from the panelist perspective? If not, we'll go to the next question. So to Aaron, how do organizations assess the risk associated with AI and genetic data? Your thoughts on that one?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Tom. So I think, fundamentally, this notion of risk assessment, we hear about it all the time. What it boils down to is what's the likelihood and the severity of threats and vulnerabilities against valued assets, considering mitigating controls. I mean, that's sort of the blueprint. When we talk about risk assessment in the context of genetic data, and AI ML, first off, I don't think there's a need to reinvent the wheel here. There's myriad risk assessment and management frameworks that exist. I think it's a matter of applying them to this context. I know there's been some really interesting work done out of, I want to say, the National University, their Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction. And this was more in the context of kinetic weapons, but I think it's instructive, applying it to the context of MLAI and genetic data / targeted pathogen technology. I'd offer that risk assessment can be framed around those two previous dimensions that I mentioned, which is the likelihood and the severity of the misuse of our capabilities, which is the convergence, and the likelihood and severity of the sort of the failure of our ordering forces, the divergence. So to the convergence notion, this notion that any intentional misuse or application of a bioweapon or engineered pathogen can cause harm or destruction. You can think of it, kind of break it down along at least 4 different parameters. How accessible is the technology? How easy is it to acquire, and what are the barriers to entry? So this accounts for things like how much funding would be needed to purchase or develop the technology, and whether that's within the means of the adversary in question. What's the ease of misuse? And this kind of considers the level of expertise and sort of tacit knowledge that would be required to engage the technology. The notion of what's kind of this time factor of what's the imminence of the potential misuse, and this speaks to how soon could a malicious actor seeking to cause harm using this technology exploit it based on how mature it is at the moment. And then finally, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind what's the magnitude of the potential harm, and that really speaks to the severity of the risk, and I think should dictate what our proportional level of response is from the standpoint of requiring controls and lockdown on the data or the technology. The failure of the ordering forces component, I think the National U folks characterize this as governability, but this is really the law, social norms, ethics component. And it really gets to this notion of, the extent to which this technology, again, bioweapons or MLAI and genetic data, the convergence is susceptible to different types of governance interventions to kind of close that delta between our technology and our laws. For one, there's this notion of how mature is the technology, how advanced is it? Is it in early stage R&D? Is it advanced development? Is it in prototype stage? Has it achieved wide commercial availability? Those are all factors to assess the risk there. I think this notion of the rate of advance of the technology itself is also impacts this notion of governability. Is the rate of advance increasing kind of linearly, or is it exponentially or whatnot? And again, because our laws are very slow to keep pace with technology, knowing that rate of change is important. There's a multidisciplinary factor that needs to be considered here too, and I think Sterling, mentioned this somewhat, which is, how many different disciplines are needed to be brought together to create or deploy, as it were, the new technology, the technology at question here. The more disciplines involved, I think the more difficult it is to govern the technology. How globally diffuse is it? Which is to say, the smaller number of countries that have access to it, I think it's easier to govern because there's this reduced, need for kind of harmonizing and coordinating laws and whatnot. So again, just some sort of tangible ways to think about how we assess the risk. We don't want to be reactive here. If we're reactive in this case, it's too late. We've seen this with the COVID pandemic situation, but yet, we also have to realize that we can't address every single potential risk that's out there.
Absolutely. Well received, Aaron. Thanks so much. And so the last question will be to Alex, and I'll unmute Alex here. So Alex, sharing DNA with companies has become commonplace in America. If people are happy to share their data, why should anyone care?
It's a great question. First, I just want to kind of underscore a couple fundamental differences in how that's happening and the motivations. This is very different than digital surveillance like we saw in the past because people are actually agreeing to share their DNA data. It's not like someone is lurking over all your web activities and seeing what you're doing. That being said, it's not always clear that they understand the implications or where all their DNA data, their genetic data may end up or what it may be used for. Additionally, they're often told it's anonymized, but some pretty clear evidence is showing that it's very difficult to truly anonymize genetic information that you can map back relatively easily to individuals. So I think that, first of all, we need something much more like we've seen digital bill of rights, but like a genetic bill of rights for individuals, almost like a consumer bill of rights, that mandates that before any data is captured for any purpose, that consumers should be well informed that these are the risks and this is how it will be used. Additionally, I think that we really need to put in place mechanisms which will limit transfer or sharing of their data with third parties without very explicit notification. Now, granted, this puts a lot of friction in the system, but frankly, that's a good thing. We've kind of seen what's happened when we've had systems with almost no friction from looking at what happened in the digital landscape. I ultimately think that people will really be very happy to share their genetic data because the upside is massive. And frankly, the number of us who are going to be targeted for bio attacks, I think, is really infinitesimally small. I don't mean to belittle that as a risk, but I think that this is a classic sort of asymmetrical gain versus risk situation. And we're already seeing this from things like 23andMe's pool of information, where they've been able to really give us some very good targets for genetic therapies based on population level genetic data. And there's only one way to get that, and that's when you have lots of people provide their data. So I think that over the future, to kind of summarize it, we need a genetic bill of rights. People will be much more agreeable to sharing their data than they have been, in other situations, because they understand that this is not like someone surveilling them. At the same time, though, that people need to be better educated on what this really means for them and what it can mean in the future. Because as Sterling said, it's not like you can change your DNA data. It's not even like, even a social security number in the US is a lot more malleable than DNA data. So I think like people really understanding that this is what you're given with, this is what you are given, and that you need to take care of this and guard this for the rest of your life is really, really important. I will throw one other piece out there, though, which is I think that we may be jumping the gun and saying that our DNA data is going to be as permanent as we say it is, because I think that something that people aren't really thinking about is that in the not so distant future, all of us will actually be genetically modified to some degree, and there could be very viable and interesting defense mechanisms that we could be putting in place, at the genetic level, just like we do at the software level. Granted, this is way over the horizon. But it's not out of the realm if we do understand some of the risks that we can put in place some of the mitigations.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Alex. That's some great comments.
Can I add something to the genetic manipulation? Alex, you might be right. In the distant future, we'll have our own genomes manipulated, but the ability to change your entire genome in your entire body is completely impossible.
Of course. No, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm saying, though, for like point vulnerabilities, so like you're talking about Parkinson's disease or things like that. I mean, anywhere where someone identifies an easy vulnerability, then that's something that becomes almost like an antivirus-like capability. And by extension, beyond those easy vulnerabilities, the complexity of actually creating genetic weapons to attack people becomes infinitely more difficult, because then you're starting to deal in many more degrees of complexities, hard to understand the interactions, epigenetics, nature, nurture, all of these things come into play, and it's much, much more difficult beyond these sort of first order vulnerabilities to really create viable weapons.
While that's true, I would point out that if the genetic data is out there, your vulnerability, you might not be aware of the vulnerability while somebody may still be able to use it against you. And we do need to look for not just, changing our DNA to solve these problems, but just curing disease. If Parkinson's disease is cured, you don't have to worry about somebody potentially accelerating the development of that disease. But commensurate with all of these advances come potential attacks, and I think we just need to be aware of where those attacks might come from. Though, Alex, I would add one thing that's often a misunderstanding in genomics is that, yes, it's extremely complicated. We thought it would be simple. We opened up the box and figured out we had no idea what any of the pieces in there are doing. And we're starting to piece it together. And as we piece it together, we realize it's more complicated than we imagined. However, machine learning methods don't necessarily care how complicated the system is. And we see many advances in machine learning that allow us to make predictions and allow us to make designs without any understanding of the system. And because AI is advancing exponentially, in the near future, we will have very strong genetic predictors for a lot of diseases, as well as the ability to develop pathways. A couple papers just came out recently that use machine learning to design pathways in microbes to produce that metabolite that you're looking for. The machine learning doesn't know how that pathway works. The scientist doesn't know how that pathway works, but somehow it works.
I totally agree with what you're saying, except for the part about the power of machine learning. I think it's actually far more limited in power than people understand, because it is such a brittle technology and really struggles once there's any variation. And I do mean any variation into the data set. It's very easy for it to make mistakes. And also people may not even recognize the mistakes because it's almost always historical and retrospective. And then I think you see evidence of this in driverless vehicles, which I thought was going to be a slam dunk, and should be. It's a much simpler problem to solve. But nope, not even close.
Yeah. So let me jump in on that notion of the complexity sort of deterring some of these notions of targeting pathogens. I think, let's accept that that's the case, but it doesn't assuage situations where you've got the law of large numbers, which is to say attackers kind of spraying and praying. They don't necessarily have to target someone, but if they know that there's a decent chance that they're going to hit their target amidst a large population, I think that alone can cause enough concern to put people on their heels. I also would just sort of comment on some of what Alex was getting at. I think we need to put some borders around both the collection and the use of this data for certain. But also this notion of, look, we have to assume that once it's out there, it's going to get in the hands of adversaries, of bad actors. And so then it sort of shifts the conversation to what does this notion of genetic data risk resilience look like? And start thinking about it from that standpoint, because it's not about eliminating the risk. It's about reducing the uncertainty of the risk. So I think we need to start thinking about our legal and technical controls from that standpoint.
I completely agree on that. And I think that the best model to look at for that actually is open source software. And it's sort of the idea that once it's out there and it's in the open, this is not going to be proprietary stuff. It's not going to be hidden. And a lot of the mechanisms that you're talking about, Aaron, I believe will be published in OpenArchive or other places like that. And so I think that the best model for looking at defenses is how have we dealt with open source software defense? And I think that that's a real challenge for large governments because they've traditionally had trouble with the idea of anything but obscurity, of security through obscurity. Sure. Whereas in reality, the agility of an entire community to respond to these threats may be our best weapon our best defense against them actually over time.
Excellent. So as a moderator, I'll go to a couple of questions from the audience. I don't know if you can see those on the screen. I can. It's WebEx weirdness here. So from the top, So Ron asked, what international groups are there in place to work in the legislative and legal guidelines for the collection and proper use of this information? Perhaps that's a question for Rock Lee, if he might comment upon that.
Sure. I mean, I can sort of give you some general comments regarding how countries are dealing with and what are the international regulations and what we are talking about. So, of course, currently we don't have any specific regulations on the bioweapons that are created via artificial intelligence tools, right? So therefore, we should differentiate based on the regulations of the bioweapons and AI safety. So what comes to the bioweapons, we see many international and national regulations. Here, the main treaty is the Biological Weapons Convention, so-called BWC, aims to limit and eliminate the bioweapons, to ensure its non-emergence. Many countries are implementing this. Biological Weapons Convention has something like 160 plus countries there. And there are also national measures which are related to the implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention. I work closely with this convention and also with Chemical Weapons Convention, with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But for the bioweapons, although for the chemical weapons, we have a big organization with 500 people working there to ensure the implementation of the treaty. With bioweapons, we have a very small implementation support unit at the United Nations, which is sitting in Geneva. Only 4 or 5 people are working there, and they're really good friends of mine doing a heroic work. But imagine that 4 people are trying to support the implementation of a treaty which applies to the 160 plus countries. Yeah. So when it comes to the genetic, yes, and that's a very difficult work to do. They are in charge and helping countries to implement the treaty, adapt the implementing legislation, so on and so forth, and doing it in a very limited capacity. So we definitely need to increase that. When it comes to the genetic data safety at the UN level, we may have instruments actually directly referring to the genetic data safety and prohibition of genetic discrimination, like the Universal Declaration of Human Genome and Human Rights, International Declaration of Human Genetic Data, and Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights can be listed, and universal normative instruments to protect this genetic data. At the regional level, we see more international treaties covering the same jurisprudence. For example, in Europe, which probably is a more prominent region in that regard, we have a Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, so-called Oviedo Convention. In one of the most comprehensive international agreements, which is on the protection of genetic data and prohibition of genetic discrimination. So all these instruments serve to aim at prevention of the bioweapons directly or indirectly. And when it comes to the regulations on AI, of course, there are a lot of international initiatives, as you know, Tom, and they taking place international, regionally, nationally. We have OECD-led initiatives, we have G20 initiatives, we have World Economic Forums, European Union, and of course, number of initiatives within the United Nations itself. At Unitary Center, which I'm heading, we are developing a specialized toolkit for use of AI by law enforcement, and some of the threats are also covered there, and a number of other regulations which we are supporting there. And at the national level, of course, we are also helping from the UN side countries to develop their AI strategies, and we work together with Tom on some of the research which was related to this. So also implementation of the machine learning models is crucial in order to come up with this sophisticated bioweapons. We do need to remember that these models are bound to be trained with the data. Therefore, when it comes to the regulations, the importance should be given on the uncontrolled public sharing of genetic databases. So this requires multi-stakeholder efforts, appropriate resources, and widespread acknowledgement that genetic information is critical infrastructure that demands secure consideration. So as I mentioned it before, at Unitary or other UN agencies, we're open for such dialogue, and we'll be happy to facilitate such dialogue at the UN level internationally as well. So I'd be happy to cooperate and engage all of you as you are experts in this regard as well.
Absolutely. Fantastic, Irakli. And I encourage attendees to contact Irakli and his colleagues if you'd like to get engaged in those amazing missions that they have that they're underway right now in the United Nations and many other groups. They're great people to work with. I can attest to that myself. So,
hey, Tom.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, let me just put a quick plug in for stateside developments on that front. So just recently, the Senate introduced the National Biometric Information Privacy Act, and it's really modeled off of the Illinois BIPA law, and essentially it would be like the first comprehensive federal law on biometric data.
Oh, wonderful.
And so, yeah, so it would basically prohibit companies from collecting and selling the biometric data without written consent. And I think most importantly, it's got bang for its buck, which is to say there's $1,000 to $5,000 per violation attached to that, which, you know, if you look at GDPR, the reason why people are shaking in their boots is because of the financial stick attached with it. So moving forward, I think we're going to see more of that. And so, yeah, just wanted to give a plug for that advancement here in the US.
Wonderful. So we have only, unfortunately, time for really one more question. And so it's going to be a broad question that any panelist could weigh in, but I'll particularly target Sterling in the beginning. So Sterling, from GeneInfoSec's perspective, what keeps you up at night? What is your biggest worry about AI and weaponization and genetic data? And after you answer, perhaps others might like to weigh in. Particularly, I'd love to hear Alex's opinion on this too.
The biggest problem that I see is that we have to have a massive shift in the way that we are thinking and looking at this data. And when it comes to the number of mistakes that we have made in the past, and I don't know, you know, they don't really fall on any individual because people are just doing the standard approach. We're sequencing the data on the standard equipment. We're sending that data to our research partners. And the challenge is, I think, getting moving individuals to accept that they've made a mistake, so that they can start to fix it. Because being in the trenches in research, I know that it's very difficult to accomplish research. So to add additional potential penalties, additional regulations is a frightening thing, and navigating those waters is something that I don't see exactly how that's gonna play out. But thanks for the question.
Sure thing. Alex or Aaron, would you like to have the last word?
I'll just add, I mean, what keeps me up at night on this subject, for me, it's about information trust and information attacks. And I don't know that it's specific to this issue space, but as we all can attest to in our current lives, this notion of, you know, can I trust what goes into and what comes out of AI ML models, and the information that I'm getting fed with regards to the risk and with regards to the viability of the solutions. Because, you know, at the end of the day, it's really about kind of perception, and all you need to do is sort of pollute the perception of trust and data. And in many cases, it's game over. It doesn't have to actually, you know, have impacted the technology or the data per se, but it's about that control of perception. And that's actually, that worries me the most.
I'll add a little bit to what Aaron is saying. I think that something that people have radically underestimated the potential impact of is adversarial attacks, which we have some pretty good evidence that other governments are already pursuing against some ML sets or some data inside of other countries. And I think that that's a tremendous risk that would pollute the pool, which is exactly what Aaron's talking about. And that's something that I think is really flying under the radar. I also worry a lot, and this is sort of a flip side, that genetic data being and ML will actually be used in ways that will promote inequality. And I know this sounds a little vague, but that, you know, if we start to create fears in society that the genetic data is being used only to help certain classes of people or certain socioeconomic status, you know, that's maybe not necessarily in the defense environment, but I think that that's just as big a risk as anything else. And I think that's something that we should probably think about, you know, not only who restricting the data, but making sure that everybody has access to the benefits of genetics plus ML.
And Tom, maybe I can. Maybe I can add really quickly what Alex was just saying about inequality. From our perspective, what we worry about is also a growing digital divide in the world. And Secretary General talks a lot, we're thinking a lot and researching a lot about this and how this is going to contribute towards this, because I fully share that the benefits of any data or benefits of any technology should be shared equally by everyone globally, and none of these technologies or none of these developments should create or contribute to the growing digital divide. The digital divide is happening, it is really growing.
Yeah.
Countries who are developing their national plans, who are investing a lot in the technology, are advancing and basically becoming richer in that sense, and the countries who are not are falling behind, and something we need to be worrying about, because we don't want to be living in a world where selected few will enjoy all the benefits and the others will not, and also will create the security risks and other consequences actually for entire planet. With that, back to you, Tom.
Absolutely, and to Ericles' excellent point, there is a great effort underway within the United Nations on digital cooperation that I've had the honor to participate in a little bit as well, and I know there's a number of countries on the line right now, and to encourage you to engage in that activity. So I'm going to just share my screen here real quick for the last months and go to the closing words. First off, thank you so much to all the brilliant panelists. So that was really insightful, and I hope that everyone in the audience was able to glean some excellent information out of this. I myself always learn when I when I get so many experts in a Zoom room or WebEx room like this today. It's always just brilliant. So I'd like to repeat that it has been our goal for running this webinar to engage the leaders in the governments, intergovernmental organizations, and businesses to better appreciate the risks and opportunities in the area of AI and genetic data. So I show our contact information for myself and Sterling, GeneInfoSec and FutureGrasp respectively. Feel free to reach out to us after this webinar. One thing I always try and encourage with these webinars is to have them be beyond just a one-off. I'd like to have obviously the pedagogy and the learning aspect of the webinar itself, but to have cultivated new relationships, new collaborations, new projects. And so feel free and reach out to any of us in this context. And again, I very much appreciate the brilliant comments by all the panelists today. And I'll sign off as moderator. And I hope everybody has a healthy and safe rest of the day, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening for you are wherever you are around the world. And again, thank you again to the panelists. It's been a true honor to moderate this excellent discussion. Have a good day.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.